Welcome everyone, panelists, attendees, and eavesdroppers to a World in Crisis panel discussion. My name is Rajani Kanth, and I'll be moderating, or at least trying to moderate. The reason I organized this discussion is simple. I felt we were fast approaching a climacteric in the area of crises which were going well beyond our carrying capacity, where perhaps if we call 911, instead of a live voice, we just might hear a recording saying, "Repeat after me, our Father who art in heaven." By the way, that was a joke I took from a pilot who apparently called air traffic control in bad weather and got that recording. Anyway, so our distinguished panelists today are Jeffrey Sachs, Vandana Shiva, Steve Keen, Genevieve Vaughan, and Guy McPherson. Our IT support throughout, if less visible than our panelists, comes from Diane Weidenkopf, who occasionally will show herself. The modus operandi. I'll go around the panel twice. The order in which we go is Guy, Steve, Genevieve, Jeff, Vandana, and last and least, Vaughan. First round to ask everyone what they view as the crisis and how they think we got to such a point. They'll have about 5+ minutes each for their take. In the second round, I'll be asking them to tell us how they feel the crisis might be ameliorated, if at all. This time, we'll have about 10+ minutes, and Diane will help us keep time. I will, in between these two rounds, vouchsafe some comments of my own. One caveat for attendees, I regret we are not going to have a Q&A simply owing to time considerations. So with no further ado, let us commence. So I'll ask Guy McPherson, climate scientist, to start us off. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everybody who's participating. Earth is amid abrupt, irreversible climate change. Even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, has reached this conclusion. The IPCC was designed to fail, as I will point out shortly. According to the IPCC, the current ongoing event is the most abrupt in planetary history. In its global warming of 1.5 degrees, published on October 8, 2018, the IPCC quoted 2 peer-reviewed papers in reaching this conclusion. Quote, "These global level rates of human-driven change far exceed the rates of change that have altered the Earth system trajectory in the past. Even abrupt geophysical events do not approach current rates of human-driven change." End quote. In the IPCC Special Report on the Ocean and Cryosphere in a Changing Climate, published on September 24, 2019, the IPCC concluded an overheated ocean was responsible for the irreversibility of climate change. This IPCC report quoted 5 peer-reviewed papers in concluding that an overheated ocean was responsible for the irreversibility of climate change. The IPCC was designed to fail when it was created during the Ronald Reagan administration. According to Michael Oppenheimer, writing for the Environmental Defense Fund website on November 1st, 2007, quote, "The U.S. government saw the creation of the IPCC as a way to prevent the activism stimulated by my colleagues and me from controlling the policy agenda," end quote. So who is Michael Oppenheimer? Oppenheimer is the Albert G. Milbank Professor of Geosciences and International Affairs in the Woodrow Wilson School and the Department of Geosciences at Princeton University. When he wrote this article for Environmental Defense, he also served as science advisor to that nonprofit organization. The IPCC replaced the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. In 1990, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases concluded that, quote, "Beyond 1 degree C, there might be rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage," end quote. In other words, 1 degree above the 1750 baseline could lead to self-reinforcing feedback loops. In this report, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases also concluded that a 2 degree C increase was, quote, "viewed as an upper limit beyond which the risks of grave damage to ecosystems and of nonlinear responses are expected to increase rapidly," end quote. Climate science writer and speaker David Spratt concluded that these self-reinforcing feedback loops were triggered at 0.5 C above the 1750 baseline. This was in a 3-part paper at Climate Code Red published on August 22nd, 2014. Spratt repeated this information during several subsequent presentations available on YouTube and Vimeo. And lest you believe we can simply reduce greenhouse gas emissions to get out of this mess, let me explain 2 important factors. 1, the aerosol masking effect, what Professor James E. Hansen calls our Faustian bargain. And 2, the uncontrolled meltdown of nuclear facilities. The aerosol masking effect has been described in more than 24 peer-reviewed papers dating back to 1929. As industrial activity produces greenhouse gases, it also produces small particles that enter the atmosphere. These particles reflect incoming sunlight back into space, therefore preventing them from striking Earth. As a result, the planet cannot be warmed by the sunlight, much less can the warmth be trapped by greenhouse gases. According to Professor James E. Hansen, in several presentations, interviews, and papers, these aerosols fall out of the atmosphere in about 5 days. This phenomenon has been widely reported recently in light of new rules regarding the use of cleaner fuel for cargo ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. The second issue refers to the uncontrolled meltdown of nuclear facilities. The resulting ionizing radiation will strip away stratospheric ozone, thus leading to very rapid heating of Earth's surface. The 2021 film Finch subtly illustrated this phenomenon, indicating that even filmmakers know about this important issue. To my knowledge, the first peer-reviewed paper describing this issue appeared in Communications, Earth and Environment on April 12, 2021 as an open access paper. And this paper was described and introduced by a phys.org article. And that's my overview. Now, did you want me to also explain at this point why and how did we get into this crisis? Okay. Well, why and how did we get into this crisis? Burning fossil fuels has led to and continues to cause heat-trapping greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I think we're all familiar with this, and probably everybody who will watch this video is also familiar with this idea. Continuing to burn these fossil fuels is fundamental to sustaining the Industrial Revolution.
1 minute.
Thank you. Continuing to burn these fossil fuels is fundamental to sustaining the Industrial Revolution. Retaining the current set of living arrangements depends heavily on burning fossil fuels. Enormous privilege comes with burning fossil fuels. In addition, more than 8 billion people now depend upon burning fossil fuels for our survival. And that covers both of the first topics for me.
Professor, you need to unmute.
Yeah. Rajani, can you unmute? I didn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve, I was just calling you a distinguished economist, which you knew already. So
Okay, thank you. Oh, I'm going to second the opening guy there. And my point is exactly the same crisis as the one that I'm frankly terrified by, the breakdown of human civilization caused by global warming. Now, I want to give a bit of background as to why Guy's perspective there has not been one that's informed development of policy or indeed development public opinion. I'm only guessing, but I'd say at least a quarter of the population regards global warming as a hoax, and probably 3/4 regards something not to worry about. There's only a tiny fraction we're actually as worried as we would be if the sort of information that Guy has been what we would be continuously receiving as coming from people who are experts on the actual climate. Now, the reason that hasn't happened is we trusted economists on this issue. When you take a look at the work of climate economists, beginning with William Nordhaus, but even going back to the other Nobel Prize winner Schelling, writing slightly before him, they regard global warming as, to quote an economist I heard at the University of New South Wales decades ago when I was doing my master's degree, if it gets a bit warm, I'll wear one less cardigan during winter. They literally map across from climate as a geological phenomenon to weather. It'll be a bit warmer, that's not a problem. And you would think this sort of nonsense would not get published in economic journals. But one of the first papers by economists to attempt to quantify the impact of climate change was by William Nordhaus in 1991, titled To Slow or Not to Slow, and published in the Economic Journal. And in that he said that 87% of American industry would be negatively affected by climate change because it takes place in carefully controlled environments, by which he included manufacturing, mining, services, everything, virtually everything was going to be unaffected except farming and a bit of forestry. Now that nonsense should have been rejected. If it had been peer reviewed by a scientist, there's no way that paper would have been published. Instead, it was peer reviewed within economics by other economists who know as little about climate as William Nordhaus did and does. And since then, a whole community has sprung up. Now, the problem is most people believe, without taking a look at the data, that what economists have done is take the work of scientists and then apply a too high a discount rate to the damages scientists have been talking about, and therefore the debates over the discount rate. That's what my other critical economist friends thought at the same time and told me, don't bother wasting your time reading the literature. They were wrong. The economists have made up their own numbers based on totally spurious grounds. That one about a roof protecting it from climate change is one. Another is that you can use current data of GDP and climate to predict the impact of climate change over time. That's led to a community of about 2,500 economists who published in the top 25 economics journals, answering a survey in 2021 by Howard and Sylvan with a Y, where they were asked what would be the impact on GDP of a trajectory towards 7 degrees of warming by 2220. Their answer was a 20% fall, median reply. 20% fall in GDP in 2 centuries' time. When you factor that back into the impact of a rate of economic growth, that is a decline in the annual rate of economic growth of 0.11%, which is slightly more than the accuracy with which actual GDP change is measured today. That nonsense is why politicians haven't taken the work of climate scientists seriously. And therefore, we've got to the point now where we're on the brink of the actual climate telling us what's going to happen. As Guy pointed out, all the research of climate scientists has been bringing forward the times at which they thought tipping points are going to occur. For example, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, the first survey to say what the impact that losing that would be, it implied it would take 3 to 5 degrees of warming. That was in 2008 in Lenton et al. On tipping points. The most recent report by the same group has said the tipping point is between 1.1 and 2.8 degrees Celsius. Now we're already at 1.5. So we're in the territory where the climate is going to change dramatically. The structure of the weather will alter in catastrophic ways that will affect the stability of our system. And that's why we've got into this. That's where we are, why we've got into places trusting economists. I think the only way to have any chance of preventing future catastrophic breakdown is to expose this work by economists, which is the worst I have read in 50 years of being a critic of mainstream economics, expel them from all the process they're part of, and that includes the IPCC. I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, I invite Genevieve Vaughan, feminist and semiotician, to take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah. As far as the reaction of the people of the world is concerned, I believe it is a crisis of denial rooted in patriarchal capitalist individualism. We are morally cowering in the face of the collapse of civilization and the environment. The problems are huge, and we prefer not to know because we don't have an effective way of dealing with them while remaining within the system as is, and we don't have an effective, peaceful way of changing the system, or even an unpeaceful way. The destruction of the environment, nuclear war, genocide, starvation, disease, are all economically driven and held in place by patriarchal capitalist strongmen and women and corporations without compassion or responsibility, and they don't have a way of changing things either. The truth is usually a gift to the listener because it informs her or him of a situation and helps them deal with it. But lies and propaganda are now money-making commercial products, undermining everyone's ability to act rationally in the world. It is hard to tell which of the stories we hear is true. Yet things are getting worse. The nature of death itself has changed. When I was younger, I used to think that when I died, I would be sad to leave nature, the trees near my house, the birds, the continuity of life. Now it appears the continuity of life will be gone, and there will only be a barren planet. So even our individual deaths are much more terrible than before, because we know the tree outside the window will not outlast us for long, and the child playing down the street will die soon too. A couple of days I was on a Zoom of women from the global South and the global North talking about genocide in Palestine. They ended saying that there is a mind sickness among the perpetrators and actually among all of us. Watching Al Jazeera's daily reports on Palestine, I see bombed out buildings and people with nothing to eat, as we will all be as the climate is altered beyond hope. Gaza is a preview of what is to come for us all, and we justify the Israelis because we too, as European American capitalists, want to eliminate our competitors, as we did when we stole the land from the indigenous peoples living on Turtle Island. We generalize our patriarchal capitalist mentality to all of humanity and begin to think that as a species, we deserve to die. But that perhaps as individuals, we will survive and that others will die instead. We hope that we will be among the chosen few in a Malthusian reduction of population by mass die-off, and this reduction perhaps also justifies the present and future genocidal wars for territory. My nephew told me recently about a movie called Thanos, where half of humanity suddenly just magically disappeared. They didn't even have to be killed by anyone. If we entertain that solution to the problem of overpopulation and lack of resources, our mind sickness will intensify and we will become perpetrators, justifying the annihilation of the other before the fact. In fact, we are going crazy even as we continue our daily lives undisturbed. We need a radically different way of looking at the world, a radically different point of departure. And I will talk about that in the next part of our session.
Thank you, Genevieve. I now invite celebrity public intellectual and economist, Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with everybody. I think we all agree, perhaps, or at least I'll put forward the proposition and very much along the lines that Genevieve just described, that we have a mindset problem. I don't think we have a lack of solutions that would improve human well-being, make our lives safer and more satisfying. I don't think we're running out of answers. We're just not applying any. And that, to my mind, is both the puzzle, the challenge, and the direction that we should attempt to surmount. I'll raise the stakes because so far we've talked about destruction of the planet through human-induced climate change and environmental destruction. But I think at least, if not more alarming, is how close we are to nuclear annihilation. And every day now we actually hear talk, including by the CIA director last week, don't worry about it. Don't worry about the bluffing and so forth. It's great that they say this beforehand because they won't have time to say it afterwards. The world will be destroyed in about 2 hours, and it will be thanks to these completely incompetent and profoundly unethical individuals that are leading us to this catastrophe. I would slightly change the orientation, or suggest we do, when we talk about, because of what we do or beliefs and so on, we live in a very structured world where actually a small number of people determine our fate, not the world as a whole. The leadership in the United States is pathological, extraordinarily dangerous for the world. Nobody's asking the opinion of the American people about the war in Ukraine or the genocide in Gaza or the ostensible coming war with China in East Asia over Taiwan. In fact, if there is any evidence, it's that the American public is very unhappy with the direction of the country, does not support the foreign policy of the United States, but I guarantee you, nobody asks. There's not a word of truth by the US leadership. There's not a word of truth by the US government. I happen to see this close up every day. As one of our CIA directors, Pompeo, once bragged, we lie, we cheat, we steal. Well, that's the behavior. It's a pathological criminal class, I think it's right to say, as the sociologist Petrokhin said 100 years ago, this political class is threatening us with our destruction. So the question is why, and I think we've already heard some good ideas about that. The philosophy of the Western world, but especially, I have to say, the Anglo-American world, because I think it's been the worst of it over the last 250 years, has been hegemony, conquest, maximum wealth accumulation, and utter dishonesty. And if there are any values at all, it is to pillage the rest of the world. And this pillaging is a mindset of the United States today. By the way, it continues to be the mindset of Britain, which I find even more warmongering than the United States, if it's possible. The British are less destructive today because they don't have their empire anymore, thank goodness. But they're even more enthusiastic about World War III than the American leaders. We could see this just last weekend when Keith Starmer was pushing for the right to use Storm Shadow missiles deep inside of Russia. And actually the Americans said no. So I look at the doomsday clock, which is the warning of the Bulletin of American Scientists, which set the hand at 7 minutes to midnight in 1947, midnight being nuclear Armageddon. Today, the hand is at 90 seconds to midnight, and I think that's an accurate reflection. And the atomic scientists have noted it's not only nuclear Armageddon, it's climate Armageddon as well. So the things we're talking about are absolutely part of this self-destruction. But I believe it's a mindset problem, of course, that pervades society, but especially pervades the power elite, because I do not think this is what the people in the world want.
We're at time. Thank you.
Sorry about that, Jeff. Thank you. Vandana Shiva is a globally renowned environmentalist, but she has one other claim to fame that people may not know. She virtually destroyed any chances of my getting tenure anywhere in an economics department because I quoted so much of her work. So anyway, with that, please join us, Vandana.
Thank you, Rajani. Thank you for organizing this. And hello, Jeff, and hello, Jen, and hello, Dee and Steve, whom I don't know yet, but I know you now. What's the crisis we are in? The crisis, many crises have been mentioned, but I think we are in a polycrisis, and all of them are interconnected. The first, of course, is the devastation of the planet, the war against the earth, which is the most foundational war. And To it is linked the destruction of the biosphere, the destruction of the climate, destruction of our soil and water systems, our food systems. And where did it start? You know, how did we get here? If we go back 500 years ago, you know, Columbus set sail for India. For our spices and our wealth, we were 25% of the world economy. But of course, he didn't realize there was land in the middle. He lost his way, and he's credited for discovering America. And that's why all the indigenous people of the Americas are called Indios. You know, in a way, they united us. And then the East India Company was created to continue that plunder. And it was the first corporation created as a limited liability corporation. And just today, I read a news that Bayer, which has inherited all the Roundup and glyphosate cases, which is losing. Everything that Monsanto pushed, the cases they're losing, and they basically are trying very hard in the US and in the States to create laws for the freedom to harm, that they should never have liability, zero liability. That's the culture they're trying to enter. Then we have the fossil age, to which both the speakers who address the climate change talk about, 100 years of coal, and then 100 years of oil. And that oil sneaked into everything. Oil became the basis of industrial farming. We're eating oil. I have had to deal with women having to deal with Coca-Cola. We're drinking oil because all they do is mine the water, steal the water, package it in a plastic bottle and say manufactured by Coca-Cola. We're thinking oil, our minds have got fossilized. We've lost our creativity and our ability to think, and it didn't happen accidentally. I so agree with Jeff, who says it is a mindset problem. And this mindset was put in place as a pillar of colonialism by people like Bacon, the father of modern science, writes a book, The Masculine Birth of Time, to destroy our relationship with nature and have reverence for nature. And the Boyles, who said, the veneration for nature is an impediment in man's empire over the world. So the empire is what they were seeking. The instrument was making the mindset, a mindset of division, of separation. I've called it ecological apartheid, the separation from nature. But with it went capitalist patriarchy, with it went racism, with it went all the hierarchies between people. Because the people who were being colonized were the originally wealthy people with the gold and the silver and the spices and the textiles. And we were rendered poor by the end of it. But to all this got added neoliberal corporate globalization, legally institutionalized with the World Trade Organization 95. And that then has created not just deepening poverty in the South, it has globalized poverty. I mean, look at the people living on the streets in Los Angeles and San Francisco. Look at the way homelessness has become a global norm. Hunger has become a global norm. And yet we live on a planet that creates abundance, and a planet that through her biosphere organizes the atmosphere and the climate system. That's what the Gaia thesis was. And when you replace all the cycles of renewal and regeneration with pumping fossil fuels into every bit of our work, and if you mentioned, of course, the nuclear war, but there is another place where a demand for nuclear is exploding. And that comes from the dematerialized world of the intensifying use of digital transactions and artificial intelligence and all the learning and the data processing. There's so much demand that no way, neither fossil fuels nor alternatives to fossil fuels can keep up with it, and they're looking for nuclear. So the limitless, how did we get here? We got here through limitless greed, parading as a civilizing mission. And that greed just finds new robes to wear. It just finds new vocabulary to talk. It finds new instruments of war. And that's what we're up against and what we have in our hands. is solidarity, a passion for democracy and freedom, but not just the freedom of humans, but freedom for all life on earth.
Thank you, Vandana. I'll be speaking now only once in this session, not twice like the rest of you. So here I go. There are several interlinked crises extant today: climate change, societal atrophy, threat of global war, and nuclear catastrophe. Interestingly, it is the societal atrophy underlying it all that rarely gets any deep scrutiny. It is my argument, made some would say ad nauseum for some 3 decades now, that all of these crises in their current form stem from the same set of systemic causes that I collate under the rubric of what I call European modernism, or EM for short. EM is the specific variant of modernism that was imposed on the world and on itself by Europe in the 17th, 18th centuries. In other words, there were other ways to modernize, but the European way was universalized. In sum, what we view around us today is the cumulative butterfly effect of bad ideas. Fish in the ocean may not be aware that they swim in water. Neither do most of us in the modern world know that we inhabit an epistemic universe crafted for us post-Enlightenment in the 19th century. EM has transformed our world, how we think, how we live, and how we engage with each other and with nature. So what constitutes this ideology? It has many components. First, it's premised upon a now obsolete philosophy of materialism. What is materialism? Everything is matter, all objects are material. Aping classical Newtonian physics. One can think of it perhaps as a mild form of physics envy. The latter-day quantum physics, of course, solidly debunks this whole notion. Secondly, it adopts a triumphalist, self-serving view of quote-unquote progress, a concept that appears in this epoch, within this system, expressed again in vulgar material terms, GDP, etc. Worse, it takes for granted that progress is wherever Europe happens to find itself. Why? Because Europe is the gold standard for the world. Thirdly, it marries science to the state, thereby risking despotism, substituting it for religion, which was its rival proxy in pre-modern medieval Europe. Fourthly, it endorses the statist use of force as needed, and I'm quoting John Stuart Mill, the patron saint of liberty. Listen to this. It's all right to force people to be free. Another ominous license for aggression in favor of any and all statist objectives. Fifthly, it adopts a contractual, instrumentalist view of society, rejecting its organic features, whence we get asocial individualism, the most toxic notion in human history, which actually sees society as but an instrument to be used to achieve individualist ends. The individual is sovereign, society is just a means. Reminds me of Dame Thatcher saying, society is just the plural of the individual. Sixthly, it sees nature as external to us humans who stand above it. By the way, women, children, and native peoples were all assimilated to being, use the German word, Naturvolk, to be raised, disciplined, and tamed. Recall Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew trope. Nature exists only to serve us. In fact, I'm told the economist Solow, at least so it's reported, once implied that we can do without nature. I sort of hear nature whisper, perhaps we can do without Solow. Seventhly, it privileges formal reason, presumed to be free of anthropic bias, over other forms of knowing. What are these other forms of knowing? Do we still remember them? Insight, intuition, common sense, revelation, etc. In economics, this morphs into this high concept called rationality, where it is by fiat, by diktat, rational to be materialist. Think of that. Remember, more is better. So what have they done? They have married the philosophy of rationalism to the philosophy of materialism. More is better is not a scientific statement. It's a value judgment. Reason is also privileged far above human emotions. Once again, women, children, native people were all assimilated to being irrational. Why? Because they are quote-unquote emotive and quote-unquote childlike. Eighthly, It sees humans as untouched by essentialist properties such as instincts. Listen to this carefully now. Animals have instincts, humans don't. Why? Since the latter presumably are cast in the image of the supernatural. You know where that comes from. Darwin's great correction came too late, but it didn't really change very much. Levi-Strauss, for instance, famously wrote, "Instincts explain nothing." Ninthly, it privileges humans as the sovereigns of creation. That's Karl Marx, by the way, set above all other forms of life, which you should recognize as the error of, or the sin of, anthropocentrism. Tenthly, it sanctions adversarialism as innate in society. That comes from Spencer, validating the idea or the ideal of a life as a brutish struggle for existence. That is Malthus, who inspired Darwin. What a strange source for inspiration. Mutual distrust is thereby institutionalized and internecine societal aggression and anger promoted. 11, it substitutes the gloss of abstract idols, which are rarely or never realized, as a decoy away from attending to real human needs. So they give you the chimera of liberté, égalité, fraternity, but quietly leave out food, clothing, and shelter. Compare the two sets. 12thly, it endorses perpetual heroic struggle as the idol of life. Remember, climb every mountain. Why the heck should we climb every mountain? All right, and the reification of labor is so close to the Protestant idea, right? You know, the Arbeit macht frei trope, where doing is endless and important. Being is seen as passive, unimportant, placing unbearable stress on vulnerable flesh and blood humans to achieve as per systemic requirements. That has been the given modernist endowment. Now, I will, of course, provide some antidotes to this entire rhetoric. Apparently, Spencer's idea of tragedy was a beautiful theory slain by a single ugly fact. So I'll give you some facts now, ugly or not. We are flesh and blood human beings, animals, mammals, sharing 99% of our DNA with chimps. Yes, chimps. Instincts, the dog that never barks in Euro-modernist theory, are built into us. And so we are not infinitely malleable into any and all engineered states of being fancied by either the left or the right. Remember, communism at one end and the open society at the other. All life on Earth is spontaneous, including our own anthropic life. It requires no engineering. Humans form communities naturally, like bees build hives and ants build hills. It is instinctive. Family, community, clan, and tribe, those are natural social habitats. Notice I did not mention state or nation. Those are imposed artifacts. Real anthropic values are also what I term the 4 C's. What are they? Community, cooperation, caring, and conviviality. They are not idols or chimeras like equality and democracy. They are real and observable, but they obtain only in Gemeinschaft formations of small face-to-face communities, not in these abstract, formal, legalistic, Euro-modernist Gesellschaft societies. That is our anthropic essence, our species being. These features are collectively embedded in us. The individual is a Euro-modernist myth. Worse, it is a Euro-modernist Frankenstein, a threat to itself and to others. So what EM does is severs us from all of our innate anthropic traits by force. Instead, it builds our societal universe on greed, that economists call capitalism, and violence or war, and on the desirability, believe it or not, of growth and development. What's that? Read that as the mantra of infinite expansion in a finite world. How brilliant can one get? It stresses, instead of the values I mentioned, competition, selfishness, and acquisitive or possessive behaviors. Once our ties to the social matrix are broken and we are, quote unquote, individuated, which means what? Set free from nurturance and mutual caring, we are transported to this EM world of what? Anomie, alienation, and angst, which Jean-Paul Sartre described so very aptly when he said, hell is other people. EM therefore transforms a warm band of wannabe convivials into a lonely, isolated, adversarial company of strangers. It gives us all the EM signature themes that we live by and in. Permanent discontent, permanent insecurity, abiding mutual distrust, and permanent war. It creates a new social form, which I have termed the amoral society, a contradiction in terms, wherein humans, divested of their moral core, turn into what? Sociopaths and psychopaths. We are an affective species forced into a rationalist, materialist EM straitjacket. And that's what EM really is, an iron cage. Humans stripped of affective umbilical ties of community and kindred lose their compass and quote near insanity. All this is evident all around us if we look around. And that is where we are today. And I hope now we should know why. And yet we can reclaim it all by breaking with grand EM myths and delusions, revalorizing familial, domestic, local, and communal modes of living instead of trying to adapt ourselves to giant, grandiose global entities. All it takes is what I've termed a transvaluation of values, individually and collectively, returning us to our species being. In other words, returning us to our essential humanity. I'll just give you one example here, since I'm talking about the meanings that existed in original anthropic society. Take the case of the family. And if you think about it, compare it to our modernist ideas. Guess what? A family is not individualist. It is not democratic. All right? It is not egalitarian, nor is it free. It's violated every single Euro-modernist norm. But it still gives us what we all crave, whether we're right wing, left wing, or any wing, sanctuary and a haven. Why? How does it do that? Because it is natural. It caters to real human needs. It is affective. It is not rationalist. And that has been the basis of original human society. Family is the basis for clan is the basis for tribe, and so on and so on. Those are the communities. But again, you don't have to reproduce them in their original form, but draw the meaning from them. What are they all based upon? Something that modernism denies. We teach that almost every day in economics. Mutual caring. Tell me which chapter in economics describes, or any modernist social theory, political science, etc. In fact, we are educated deliberately and willfully away from that. So all contrived societal institutions like Euro-modernism rest on fragile belief systems which can be cast off, turning us into what we are not. That is the EM project, and that's difficult and hazardous. But returning us to who we really are, why, that is natural. It's easy. Much haste is called for in this, since time is very short, lest we hear that last broadcast on the evening news. The world ends tonight at 9, details at 11. Thank you. All right, now we move to the second round, and it'll be the same order again as before. So if Guy can start us off, that'll be great. Thank you.
So the question is, how do we get out of it? I see no way out. In fact, civilization itself is a heat engine, as pointed out by 5 peer-reviewed papers written by Professor of Atmospheric Sciences Tim Garrett at the University of Utah. One of these papers, published in Earth System Dynamics on January 5th, 2021, is titled No Way Out? The Double Bind in Seeking Global Prosperity Alongside Mitigated Climate Change. This open access paper indicates that civilization must be destroyed if we are to stop overheating Earth. Never mind the ethics of destroying the set of living arrangements. Doing so will cause the abrupt loss of aerosol masking and also the uncontrolled meltdown of nuclear facilities. Either phenomenon will cause the extinction of our species and probably the extinction of all life on Earth. Why all life on Earth? According to a peer-reviewed open access paper by Strona and Bradshaw in Scientific Reports, part of the renowned Nature series of publications, a rise in global temperature of 5 to 6 C will cause the extinction of all life on Earth. This rise in global temperature would take place over a few centuries to accomplish that task of destroying all life on Earth. Strona and Bradshaw included this wording in their paper, quote, life could survive in peculiar habitats such as hydrothermal vents and a rogue, seemingly desert Earth wandering across the universe could still have some tiny chance of blooming again under some lucky and unlikely circumstances, end quote. As any ecologist knows, the rate of environmental change is critically important to the continued existence of ecological entities. For example, as reported in a peer-reviewed open access paper in Oikos on December 28, 2022, the rapid rate of environmental change, quote, restricts the ability of organisms, populations, or communities, i.e. ecological entities, to respond, end quote. This quote comes from a paper authored by 13 scholars. A rise in planetary temperature of 5 to 6 C might not be needed to cause the extinction of all life on Earth. We are already 2 C above the 1750 baseline, according to a report released by governments of the world in October 2023. An additional increase of 2 to 3 C is less important than the rate of environmental change. As indicated by the IPCC in its October 8, 2018 report, Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, the ongoing rate of environmental change is the fastest in planetary history. Could this rate actually increase? In fact, the first ice-free Arctic Ocean in some 70,000 years could very well lead to an even faster rate of environmental change than the planet is experiencing right now. According to a peer-reviewed open access paper in Geophysical Research Letters published on June 20th, 2019, the loss of albedo associated with an ice-free Arctic Ocean will cause the, quote, equivalent to the effect of 1 trillion tons of CO2 emissions, end quote. This is about the same as 25 years of emissions within a few months. Lest you believe an ice-free Arctic Ocean cannot occur relatively soon, consider the case of James Anderson, the Harvard professor who led the research team that discovered the link between chlorofluorocarbons and the so-called hole in the ozone layer. After delivering a presentation in Chicago, he was quoted in Forbes, quote, "The chance there will be permanent ice in the Arctic after 2022 is essentially zero." Professor Jennifer McKinnon at the University of California, San Diego was interviewed by CBS News more than 3 years after Anderson's line was published. She indicated that an ice-free Arctic Ocean would occur in 2022. Fortunately, both of these renowned scholars were incorrect with their predictions. And it gets better. The U.S. Navy Postgraduate School has issued their 6-month ensemble forecast for this year, 2024. The forecast indicates there will be more than 2.5 million square kilometers of ice floating on the Arctic Ocean in late September at the nadir of ice. Yet again, we have escaped the existential threat over which we have the least control. But again, I see no way out of the mess we have collectively created. Continuing to burn fossil fuels will accelerate the rate of environmental change underlying the ongoing mass extinction event. Reducing industrial activity will invoke the aerosol masking effect, thereby accelerating the rate of environmental change even faster. Many people have suggested using some form of geoengineering to compensate for atmospheric greenhouse gases. The IPCC addressed this issue in its 6th assessment report, and I'm not going to get into the details because if you want, you can look it up. Box TS.8 on page 104 that includes relevant information about geoengineering and its potential for utter disaster, even if we do it correctly, whatever that is. So that's all bad news so far. And I think it's as accurate as can be expected from peer-reviewed journal articles written by a broad array of people. So for many years, I have promoted the idea of planetary hospice. As with hospice involving individuals who have been given a terminal diagnosis, we can extend and apply the ideas of hospice and palliative care to our own lives. After all, hospice focuses on the care, comfort, and quality of life for a person who is approaching their death. Considering the evidence underlying the idea that our time draws near, it seems reasonable to apply similar principles. In fact, I often use this line, birth is a sexually transmitted disease that is proven fatal in every case. And yet, so many people don't seem to acknowledge that we are going to die. Memento mori, we too will die. I suggest living our lives in the context of 3 categories. 1, family and friends. 2, community. And 3, society. And I recognize that this three-category system is overly simplistic. I also recognize that these three categories overlap. They nonetheless offer a starting point from which we can ponder our roles in life, as well as our acts. Such self-examination is worthy, as well as painful. At the level of family and friends, I suggest that we treat everyone near us as we would treat our beloved elderly grandmother. Respect and honesty are key components of such behavior. Imagine the disappointment of your grandmother, she discovers you have lied to her, and she always discovers the lie. Imagine her disappointment in you when you disrespect her in other ways. So there are things we can do at the individual and family level, family and friends. How we act at the level of community poses greater challenges than our actions at the level of family and close friends. How shall we contribute to our community? If we believe it takes a community to raise a child, then does it make sense to contribute positively to our community? If so, then shall we work to terminate racism, misogyny, and other forms of injustice? Obviously, working to improve our communities falls into the large category of easier said than done. We all want to benefit from living in a community that respects all its neighbors. What steps can we take to get from a civilization characterized by rampant misogyny, racism, and monetary disparity to a community devoid of these undesirable fates? I can think of a few steps we can take, and I've written about it extensively at guymcpherson.com. You can use the search box there if you want to find out more information. Moving beyond policies and their implementation, we can spend time in the streets cleaning up our ugly messes. You don't have to go very far to find a city where the messes are truly horrific. We can speak with those less fortunate than ourselves. We can listen to them. We can learn what they need. We can attempt to fulfill their needs. We can prepare food and give it to the houseless among us. We can pay for the education of those in poverty. These are ideas that so-called liberals have expressed for a couple of centuries, and perhaps we'll have better luck working at the individual level than we do at the societal level. I strongly suspect misogyny, racism, and monetary disparity have been defining elements of every civilization so far. Ridding global industrial civilization of these undesirable attributes poses a daunting challenge at which I doubt we will exceed. Taking on such a challenge, in the face of seemingly impossible odds, can be a measure of our character. Let us undertake this greatest of challenges, despite the longest of odds. At the level of society, there's very little any of us can do. However, I can think of one job that is worth our collective attention. There may be others. Working to cask and contain nuclear material represents one of our duties as planetary citizens. Leaving in our wake more than 450 nuclear reactors and more than 1,200 pools of so-called spent nuclear fuel has the potential to destroy all life on Earth. I can imagine no greater obligation than cleaning up the worst of our messes as we exit the planetary stage. Even if this task proves impossible, as I suspect it will, taking it on demonstrates our worthiness as the last individuals of our species. So it seems there are things that we can do if we are willing, and they don't fall into the category of impossible, as nearly as I can tell. So
1 minute.
I will leave it right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy. Now I'll ask Steve to pick it up.
Okay, okay. My general pessimism, I don't have quite the level of experience of the political class that Jeffrey has, but I have a similar attitude towards them. I find it quite laughable when I see people saying, but this is all planned by the World Economic Forum. My basic reaction, having met a few of those people involved and done a few bit of dealing with them at the UK Parliament, the Australian Parliament, they couldn't plan lunch, let alone a global conspiracy. So it's nonsense to say that this is planned. This is a catastrophe. A bunch of Keystone cops controlling an out of at the controls of an out of control train that they don't know how to use. So they're pressing the wrong buttons. That's why we're headed towards where we are going right now. Equally, they're as denialist about the state we're in as anyone else. I think the comments that I think Genevieve made earlier about a state of global denialism is quite realistic. Most people would prefer to be discussing the sports or TikTok or fashion than what we're talking about here. Thinking systemically is not a human habit. habit. It's something which goes beyond the usual level of reasoning that our species is capable of. And we've been distracted even from that by some of our intellectual structures like neoclassical economics, which I think is anti-systemic and a large part of why we've reached this point without any success so far. So I'm not expecting any turnaround in current policy until we start seeing catastrophic impacts. And by catastrophic impacts, I mean climate events that kill lots of white people. Okay. It won't happen while it's brown people dying. Okay. And even then, it's got to be the right white people. I think it will take more notice of a catastrophe that kills 50 million Texans than one that kills 50 million Russians. Okay. So when that happens, and it's no longer a case of if, it's a question of when a catastrophe of that scale happens, then we might finally be forced to take this seriously. The last people we want to do this are the ones who are currently in control, but that's where we're going to start from. So we then need to have a reaction. I can't help coming back to thinking of Winston Churchill in World War II, where he was warning and being ignored about the dangers of Hitler, the rise of Hitler, and appeasement was on the menu. Now, there are arguments that that wasn't actually what Chamberlain was doing, but I'll leave those to the side for the moment. But the idea of peace in our time is a bit like, green growth in the modern terms. The Churchillian realization is that this is a struggle to survive and that we have to completely devote all our resources to that survival. And to do that, our resources we're currently wasting in extravagant lifestyles for the ultra-wealthy have to go. Now, the way that was achieved in the World War II was by rationing. And I think we need a similar thing coming our way. At some point, forget about your Louis Vuitton handbags, forget about your first-class travel. We have to reduce drastically the amount of energy we consume. And the only way that can be done without killing lots of poor people is by the rich being unable to consume at the levels they consume right now. Now, I've worked with one scheme to do this in a market-style approach with Adam Hardy, who I think was here earlier. And that's the idea of what we call a parallel currency. You can see the detail at www.ecocore.org. And the proposal there is to have, as well as having existing currency created by private banks and by governments as we currently have, credit and fiat money, we have a parallel currency issued to each country, and I'm not talking global solutions here, because one of the reasons we've failed to do anything so far is trying to do the link at a globalized level. That I actually see as a tactic of the oil industry to stop anything happening, because they know nothing ever gets decided at a global level. So globalization is a route to failure, not success. So I'd say at a national level, this is the EcoCore proposal, broadly speaking. We create a currency, a carbon credit, tradable carbon credit, which is issued to everybody in the country, and the amount you get is the average carbon consumption of that country. Now, given the incredibly skewed income distribution we have now, that means at least 90%, possibly 95% of the people would not use their entire carbon allowance. So they'd have surplus carbon credits they could trade. The top 5%, certainly the top 10% in each country would find themselves running out of carbon credits pretty much when they got out of bed, and therefore they'd need to buy those carbon credits off the poor. Now, rather than the bullshit, pardon the French, but that's the best way to describe it, of economists trying to estimate the social cost of carbon, this would be a market-based system. If you wanted to go and buy whatever you wanted to buy, whether that was avgas for your jet or cornflakes, you'd need to pay the carbon price as well as the money price, and if the rich running out of it, they need to buy them off the poor. So it's an income redistribution scheme that goes directly from the rich to the poor through the market. And that would put enormous pressure both on the rich to reduce their carbon consumption and on the industrial side of capitalism, the thing which you can give it the most credit for, the innovation that's occurred in the last quarter millennium is literally astronomical. That innovation would be driven towards reducing our carbon footprint and doing it at hyper speed, far faster than is being done right now. So those are solutions I can consider, but ultimately we have to realize that we have overstepped the limits of our capacity to use the resource of this planet, the biosphere, at a sustainable level by at least a factor of 2. That's being a ludicrous optimist, more likely a factor of 4 or 5. So unless we reduce our footprint drastically, we're going to fail. And then on top of that, I know all the dangers with geoengineering. I can't see us avoiding them. If we have the type of breakdown in the Arctic Circle that Guy was talking about a while ago, then that is going to mean it's a radical acceleration in the damage being done, not by ourselves anymore, but the damage we've triggered in the feedback systems of the planet. So unless we get prepared to try to have some way of reversing them, we need what the group called MIR, and that stands for Mirrors for Earth's Energy Rebalancing, mir.org. They are trying to develop a low-cost way of reflecting solar energy back into outer space using plastics and basically cheap materials you can turn into cheap mirrors that are placed on the surface of the planet and can reverse the warming. Unless I think we're going to find ourselves not only driven to do that to reduce the damage we've already done, but quite probably to reduce the level of the temperature below the pre-industrial level to have some chance of trying to reverse the global and planetary level of forces we've unwittingly unleashed. And in that process, millions, perhaps billions could die, but that's a gamble. If we don't do something like this, I think that loss of lives is a certainty.
Thank you, Steve. I must say, some cheerful thoughts coming to us. But anyway, I think maybe Genevieve will help pick things up here, especially our spirits.
Okay, let's get my paper up here. We are operating under the wrong paradigm in economics and everywhere because we leave out a basic part of life. We need a radical change and a radically different solution, and I have been working on one for many years. I propose that we are actually a maternal species, not Homo sapiens sapiens, because we don't know who we are, and that we don't know. Instead, we are Homo donans and recipients, the giving and receiving species. And our collective capitalist transformation into Homo economicus is contradicting our potential to survive and thrive as a species together with each other and all the other species on Mother Earth. Marcel Mauss described the gift economy as a three-step process of giving, receiving, and giving back. However, like so many others, he did not realize that the first two steps already create a basic human relation, and that these first unilateral steps are the universal structure of the mothering of young children. Other anthropologists and social critics after Mauss, who have studied and proposed the model of indigenous gift economies, have not recognized the fundamental importance of the unilateral maternal gift economy that is required in early life for the survival of the human child. Marshall Salins, Louis Hyde, David Graeber, Alain Caillet, Charles Eisenstein, and many others who are proponents of the gift economy have not recognized unilateral maternal giving as the original relational model that is presented to the human infant, because otherwise the infant dies. By unilateral, I do not mean that the baby does not respond, but that at least in the first years, excuse me, I'm losing my piece of paper here. At least in the first years, the mother feeds the baby does not feed the mother. The provisioning interaction is mirrored and repeated by the child with smiles and sounds and gestures that are received by the mother and mirrored again by her in what researchers call serve and return or proto-conversation. This is not a quid pro quo exchange, however, but an alternating communicative giving and receiving that creates a relation of mutuality and trust at the same time that the material and giving and receiving permit the child to live. My contention is that this unilateral giving and receiving lays down the original and persistent logical structure of human life, but that this is misunderstood as a primitive quid pro quo exchange by a society that is steeped in the ideology of commodity exchange and capitalism. Unilateral gifting seems to be impossible for humans, perhaps only a capacity of God. Instead, it is commonplace and structural, and it underlies many mysteries that are explained in other ways by a science that until recently has excluded mothers and children. In the last 50 years, however, the rise of the science of infancy research and child development has had to include mothering. One particular discipline, interpersonal neuropsychology, by Alan Shore and Daniel Siegel, has studied epigenesis in early childhood, showing that the brain is sculpted by mother-child interactions, and therefore, I say, by the maternal gift economy, though they don't call it that. The neuron connections are established during all the repeated interactions of nurture of various kinds. The brain is sculpted by this because periodically there is a massive die-off of neurons that have not been activated by experience. I believe the unilateral gift is the original model for much of our behavior, and that it underlies our lives as a matrix of schemas that are repeated at every level. I have written about it as the underlying framework for communication, language, and syntax, but it can also be seen as a schema underlying purposeful actions like going from one place to another, walking, giving one foot forward to the earth and then the other, throwing and catching a ball, pouring tea into a cup, Lego games and jigsaw puzzles, cogwheels, electric plugs, and machines, and innumerable other interactions, including negative variations where gifting is transformed into hitting, giving harm, or even shooting, giving the so-called gift of death, and in exchange, the return gift of vengeance. At the physiological level, breathing in and out, the circulation of the blood, the sending and receiving of impulses by neurons are all gifting and receiving. We do not even see this matrix because we are caught in the gift-denying logic of quid pro quo exchange, which contradicts unilateral giving and abstracts from it, creating what Alfred Sohn-Raphael called the exchange abstraction, an abstraction in reality that he believed is the basis of our abstract thought. The abstraction is caused by the contradiction of the logic of the unilateral gift by the logic of quid pro quo exchange. At around 3 years of age in capitalism, the child begins to understand and experience bilateral quid pro quo exchange, which contradicts unilateral gifting. This interaction must be understood and assimilated. New neuron connections formed, resculpting a brain that has already its basic neurons connected have been elicited and confirmed by gifting. But even without referencing the brain, we can see how the practice of the unilateral gift and the implication of the value of the other to the giver that is activated by giving her a unilateral gift is contradicted by the superimposition of the logic of exchange, where the satisfaction of another's need is contingent upon the return of an item of equal value. Value is not given to the other, as it is in gifting, but to money as the abstract arbiter of quantities of exchange values of products, no longer gifts. And then money itself can be accumulated, given away, and given in exchange again and again. The important process of exchange and the equation of value has been written about again and again, and I do not have the time to go into it more thoroughly here. What I do want to emphasize, though, is that discussions of exchange do not usually, or perhaps ever, include the unilateral maternal gift economy, which is prior to bilateral exchange in every life. Instead, exchange appears to be primary, the original model of human interaction, upon which gifting appears to be an aberration, a moral exploit, if indeed it exists at all. Consequently, many writers, even feminists, use the word exchange to describe the interaction between mothers and infants, And this misnomer and overly broad use of the word deviates attention away from the unilateral maternal economy and its other-oriented logic and values, making it appear to be only an exception to a seemingly more basic human interaction of exchange. This reversal alters the analysis while putting the maternal economy at the beginning where it belongs, throws a different light on everything and reveals the parasitic character of the economy of exchange that is nurtured by the gifts of the unilateral gift economy, which is its host. We can think of surplus value, the value of the work over and above the cost of the reproduction of the worker, and to which the gift of women's domestic work largely contributes, also as a gift to the capitalist by the worker, leveraged by the capitalists, by the workers' situation of propertylessness, lack of access to free gifts, and dependence on the system for survival. Women's unwaged domestic labor is gift labor that flows into surplus value, and together with it makes up the gift of profit that is free to the capitalist. This is the case even when the woman herself is the worker also creating surplus value. By following the thread of the unilateral gift, we can find it at all levels where it has not been seen, and realize that it gives an alternative explanation of who we are and what we need to do to survive. We are a mothering species, homo donans and recipients, but we are now, women and men, collectively mothering a parasitic economic system that is destroying our species and the planet. Women and men need to reclaim their maternal heritage of other tending, of altercentrism, giving value to the receiver, liberated from the parasite of patriarchal capitalism. I have a few sentences about what we could do now. That is, what recognize the gift economy where it already exists in the individual and society. Take it, not exchange, as the beginning of the thread of our humanity. Recognize it everywhere and empower it individually, and begin to practice it without shame socially, because people need gifts.
Thank you, Jen. Now we'll have to ask Jeff to continue, please.
Great, thank you very much. I'll be brief, and I want to return to Rajani's wonderful statement, but I would like to suggest a refinement to it. I think what we are really looking at is specifically British philosophy, not even so much European philosophy. Many in Europe were better. The British have a very distinctive track of philosophy that begins with Francis Bacon, and I would trace through to Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Smith, Malthus, Mill, Spencer, and Darwin. And I think that's really the world that we're living in. Many other, even European variants are quite distinct from this. But this is the philosophy of will and of power and of instrumental rationality, not rationality in the Aristotelian sense of behaving like a social animal. It is the rationality as Hume defined it when he said, "'Tis not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger," which Hume wrote, of course, in the Treatise of Human Nature. Well, to define rationality that way is to say that the greatest insanity is rational. And that's what we're all discussing, a kind of insanity of destroying the world, an insanity of being 90 seconds to midnight by all the game theorists playing their nuclear war games or neglecting the climate crisis. So I do believe that the British vision is very distinctive. By the way, it's fascinating. Hobbes and Locke, who proposed the social contract, and Hobbes especially, who said that in the state of nature, life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, which is the opposite of, again, an Aristotelian view of what human nature is about, which is gregarious, social at the core. Hobbes thought it was solitary and that we would all kill each other. But what's interesting is that what Hobbes was describing was actually literally what the British were doing in setting up joint stock companies to go exploit other places in the world. Remember that when Hobbes was writing, the East India Company was not a company, it was it was an army and a war machine to take over progressively the Indian subcontinent. And it was not a society in the Aristotelian sense that people cared for each other, that what Rajani called the organic connections of people mattered. It was a society in the legal sense of people coming together for profit and for profit only. They had no social bonds among themselves, the shareholders of the East India Company. They didn't know each other. They didn't care about each other. They were part of a legal society, a corporation. And that is the image of Britain of what a society is. It's not a society of people who have an organic connection with each other. Margaret Thatcher said as much. Literally, she said, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. One could add, only shareholders. Otherwise, this is not a real society. So I think we're living in that vision. It became darker and darker over time, by the way. Maybe it reached its optimistic apogee with Smith, who was a nice man by all accounts, a humanist even, but he was followed soon by Malthus, who said we're all doomed anyway to subsistence. And then from there to Spencer and Darwin, that this is really a struggle for survival and you might as well leave the weak to die or their deaths are inevitable. And so I think that this is very particular. Now, the reason I mention this is that the United States inherited this, embedded this, embodied this in our culture and in our Constitution. We have a Lockean Constitution. The government's not to do much other than to protect private property and to engage in the same kind of hegemonic aspirations abroad that Britain taught to the Americans. Now, here's the point I want to make. We're at the end of this Anglo-American hegemonic world. I hope it's not the end of the world, which the United States could provoke, but we're at the end of this period of military, technological, and economic and dominance. That's a wonderful thing. We've reached, again, truly a multipolar world. For the first time in a century and a half, Asia is now more than half of world output. This is something different. And this is where the hope comes from. We have the chance for a different outlook, not an outlook that is the Hobbes, Locke, Hume, Smith, Malthus, Spencer, Darwin outlook, but an outlook that is far richer, more humane, based on different civilizational traditions. In the West, I'm happen to be an Aristotelian, but Confucian or Hindu or Buddhist outlooks have their say right now in a way that was not realistic 50 or 100 years ago, given British or American hegemony. So I'm actually not so pessimistic, assuming we don't blow ourselves up being 90 seconds to midnight. I believe that we need to focus on globally shared goals, which is a good thing, by the way. The Sustainable Development Goals, for example, those are the world's goals. The United States doesn't give a whit about them, doesn't even know they exist. But the rest of the world would actually like a world that is inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and peaceful, as the goals call for, and want to work towards that. Again, the United States does not. As a matter of official policy, it doesn't discuss the SDGs, but other countries do. So I would like us to focus on how civilizational interchange, and I believe the possibility of a true global ethics can emerge, and one that recognizes what deeply counts for humanity, which is our well-being, our true organic connections in society, the richness and benefit of diversity, and the overwhelming value of peace. And this is the world that we could help to create, especially in the post-Anglo-American world, because we've arrived at that point where we have the voices from around the world, and we have the place for the great civilizations of the world to take their role in creating the kind of world that we want. So those are my brief observations.
Thank you, Jeff. Now, if Vandana would join us. Yeah.
And now I apologize, Rajani, as we discussed, I have to depart, but I
fully
want to
understand.
thank everybody for being together, and such an honor to be with all of you.
Thank you for being here, Jeff.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, Jeff.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
And just before you go, one Aristotelian recognition that economy is the art of living. Making money is chromatistics, and the two are very different phenomena. They're two very different processes. So how do we get out of the mess? The roots of the mess have been laid out by everyone, and Rajani, you did the overarching thing. Genevieve Vaughan showed how economy as grabbing, as taking, as extraction, as domination, and to remind ourselves of this attempt to call science the processes of making nature your slave, that is what we have to get out of. And for that, we have to remember, as Rajani said, we are bodily beings, we are earth beings, we are made of the earth, we are part of the earth, we are not separate, we are not masters, we are not owners. And Locke was mentioned, who justified the creation of private property. And while enclosures of the commons were happening, didn't talk about it, pretended that he was talking about the primitive people of America who didn't know how to build fences for their bison. And therefore, their resources and land could be taken away. Anthropocentric arrogance that went with it. And to get out of that, all we have to remember is we're part of an earth family. All other beings are our relatives. And that has been not just the worldview of all indigenous cultures. And and in the West, they somehow really take Hobbes seriously. That everyone was clawing each other to that and fighting. They didn't know how to live as community. They did, and they do still. Most of the world is organized as community even today. The state is not organizing them. People are organizing themselves. And even today, 80% of the food that we eat comes from small farms that are self-organized entities. So getting out of anthropocentric arrogance and knowing we are earth beings, we are living beings, connected to other beings, in the gift economy, as Genevieve talked about, when the mycorrhizal fungi gives nourishment to the plant and the plant gives nourishment to the mycorrhizal fungi, both are giving nourishment to us. And reclaiming our commons from these enclosures and monopolies created by greed. Began with the enclosures of the commons and land, but my life over the last 4 decades has been dedicated to keeping seed and biodiversity in the commons, because the Monsantos just sat and made a law that seed design mentioned. It's a machine we created. And the Supreme Court of the US even rules that seed is a self-replicating machine invented by Monsanto, and farmers saving seed are stealing the intellectual property right. So this is in our everyday lives, we can do it. But food is a big issue. In my view, the more I've dedicated my life to understanding the system, food is the currency of life. Food connects us to soil, to the plants, to the earthworms, to the pollinators, to the atmosphere. Today's polycrisis and ecological crisis are deeply rooted in a fossil fuel way of producing food. An industrial fossil fuel based and fossil chemical based system of producing food as oil. 75% of the soil and water is being destroyed by a system that is hungry for land and hungry for water because of the chemicals. 90% of the biodiversity gone because you create chemicals to wipe it out. If insects disappear and 80% are gone, it's because you've created insecticides to wipe them out because you defined insects as your enemy and not seeing them as your friends. Definitely the cultivated diversity, 90% is gone. And related to this, related to the destruction of the biosphere, is the 50% emissions that come from the industrial food system, both the production, the processing, the destruction of forests for commodities like soya, and long food miles. It adds up to about 50% emissions. For bad food, that's making people sick too. 75% chronic diseases today are linked to a fossil fuel, fossil chemical based food system. And yet we can get out of this because there are other ways to produce food and better food. I've just done a new book called The Nature of Nature, The Metabolic Disorder of Climate Change. And I've mentioned it as a metabolic disorder because we still think of the earth as a dead machine, as a dead accumulation of dead matter. But the earth is a living organism and she manages the climate. And just like our bodies maintain health, and junk food and processed food, ultra processed food, destroys the metabolic stability of our body and gives us metabolic disorders, I see climate change as a metabolic disorder of a living earth. So another way to get out of the crisis is to recognize that the earth is living. And we are part of that living earth. And we're intelligent. And other beings are intelligent. All that intelligence was taken away by the Baconian idea of turning everything into dead matter in a dead earth. And if we just think of the fact that over 4 billion years, the earth, through photosynthesis, pulled down the temperature from 290 degrees to 13 degrees. The concentration of CO2 from 98% to 0.03%, which has increased a bit now. But when we turn to the Earth's technologies, and it is not the case that only Silicon Valley has technologies. Each woman has technologies for the art of giving. Each peasant has a technology for growing food, and the earth herself has technologies. This is what Buckminster Fuller pointed out. In its complexities of design integrity, the universe is technology, transformation. The technology evolved by man is very pathetic compared to the elegance of non-humanly contrived regeneration. Man does not spontaneously recognize the technology in nature and then just reduces everything to a dead nature. The natural is the real technological. And the natural has now been named by scientists who work on living systems as autopoietic, the power to self-organize. And that is also true for free societies. They self-organize. Individuals as part of society self-organize. That's what community is. Relationships linked through the art of giving. A way of our community species existence. But this is not just about looking at 4 billion years of the past. This is the work we do. I saved seeds, and I said there is no way we will allow the enclosures of the seed and establishment of a monopoly by a handful of poison makers over the life on earth. And we've created 150 community seed banks. We've fought cases against the pirates of today, who are the biopirates, who steal indigenous knowledge and claim it to be their invention. But most importantly, working with the earth and her laws of biodiversity and recycling, by intensifying biodiversity and intensifying the technology of nature, the photosynthesis, we can grow 2 times the food that the planet needs. And we were called primitive, our seeds were called primitive. I've been saving seeds now for 4 decades. And the other day we decided to study the nutrition of our old seeds, which were called primitive, and the so-called modern varieties. Our old seeds give us 146% more calcium, 135% more iron, 169% more manganese, and 80% more zinc. So nutritionally empty commodities does not provide food needs. The measure of yield is merely the extractive measure of taking away from the farm and putting it in the market. But this is nutritionally empty, causing so much of the disease. But nutritionally dense systems are where we work as members of an earth community. And as members of the earth community, we can address the climate problem. It's not that there is no hope. If you just do a linear extraction model, of course there's no hope. But if you just return to the earth and say, we are part of this amazing phenomena, just give you 2 figures. If 10% of the land was farmed organically in 10 years, we could totally neutralize the emissions. Every year, the emissions are about 2680.88 gigatons. We have, between the soil and the plant biodiversity and the mycorrhizal fungi, we have the potential of 34.74. And then, another study just says just 1% return of the gift of carbon to the soil, just 1%, can pull out from the atmosphere more carbon dioxide than the emissions, which does not give excuse to continue the emissions. But it does give us the hope that working as Earth citizens, creating an Earth democracy, we can address the multiple polycrises that a greed empire, a fossil fuel empire has created over a very short period of time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vandana. In my role as interlocutor here, let me pose this question for all the panelists, and you can choose to answer them as you will. I don't place any faith in the word hope. As Ben Franklin said, people who live on hope die of starvation. So instead, what do you think is the rational expectation of the planet, the species, just life continuing on in the period we're living in? And perhaps our scientists here can help us, people like Guy and Vandana and so on. What do you think, Guy? Are we going to make it? Are we going to survive?
It would surprise me very much. Because of the aerosol masking effect, because of nuclear power plants melting down, terminating or even slowing industrial civilization is a prescription for disaster in the very near term. On the other hand, keeping the shit show running, this set of living arrangements going, and our motto apparently is must go faster. Every year, things speed up. Well, that's another prescription for extinction of our species and therefore the extinction of all life on Earth. So as much as I would love to see some evidence to the contrary, I don't see us changing our behavior in significant ways that will allow us to continue. We just want everything.
So how much time would you give us?
You know, it's interesting. I get that question asked of me almost every day. And my go-to response now is 3 minutes. You have 3 minutes. 3 minutes. And with every breath, you get a reset. So my point in saying that is that I encourage people to live in the moment, to live in the here and the now. And I recognize that you still have to make enough money to pay the rent and buy the groceries and so on. But most of us are very intent upon a future that I can't even imagine, a future for our children and grandchildren that's 50 or 100 years away. And as much as I think it's a good idea to live with that future in mind, and I thought that my entire life, now I realize that if we don't have that long, and abundant evidence indicates that we don't have that long, that we don't have decades, much less centuries, then maybe we should attempt to live in the here and the now. Maybe we should treat the people that we interact with on a regular basis the way we would want to be treated. And that does not mean, by the way, telling everybody they're going to die soon, because I learned through personal experience that's a really bad idea. That's a terrible way to start a conversation. So I know I'm giving mixed messages here, and I'm not sure how to reconcile them, because the evidence indicates that our time is short, and I would like us to live as if our time is short, but I mean that in the most positive of ways, not our time is short, so I need to murder everybody so that I get all the gold. And because that doesn't make any sense at all. So, sorry, I don't feel like I have a coherent message here.
Yeah, a long time ago, Dickens said, he wrote famous lines, "It's the best of times," he wrote, "it's the worst of times." So could it be that he would only be half right in his application to our times? But anyway, let me ask Vandana what she thinks.
Well, hope is not something you buy on a supermarket shelf. You can't have hope in hope if it's a commodity to be purchased. But hope as cultivation, as care, as an action you're engaged in, that is where the hope comes from, not as the outcome of the process, but the meaningful engagement in the process. And hope then comes from two things. You mentioned quantum theory, how it actually, basically showed that the mechanical universe assumptions were so wrong. But quantum theory also told us there's issue of potential. We have the potential to be different. And I would not agree with that to define industrial civilization. Civilization is that which has organizing of ideas, of people in organic relationship. The word civilized in our language means to that which binds and holds us in values. Industrialism is a process defined by fossil fuel use. A process of production does not define society as a whole. So to use the word civilization for this, when Gandhi was asked, what do you think of industrial civilization? He said, it would be a good idea, but it hasn't elevated itself to that level of being a civilization. It is just a method of manufacture. And then it constructed around systems, a fake method of efficiency, a fake way of calculating productivity. Emery Lovins did this amazing calculation. Every time we talk of climate change, we should be talking of energy slaves. The third world does not use energy slaves. We don't use energy slaves. We farm ourselves. The American way has 250 times more energy slaves and will be having even more. And if we were to take their population into account, because they are putting pressure on the planet, that's what's driving the climate havoc. We actually have a population of 3.35 trillion, not 7 point something billion. And we hide so much of the footprint. We hide so much of the externalities and the pollution. And I think elevating techniques to civilization is the disease of the modern day. And I didn't mention earlier that there is a whole group they call themselves the eco-modernists. They say we'll trash the planet and we will pretend we'll save it. So their latest slogan is fake food from labs as a climate solution. But all the research is showing that lab food will need 5 times more land for feedstock, will have 25 times more emissions because of energy intensity. So I think the first element of hope for me is just the ability of human beings, and more human beings are waking up to be able to differentiate between false claims and the lived truth, what you call the organic. And that will be an increasing test we face, And the most important issue is most of the world is not part of industrial societies. It's not. Most people of the world are farmers, and most farmers are women. Most farmers of the world are women working on small farms, producing most of the food we eat. So I think we've had this habit of universalizing a particular point of view, but it's a very local point of view. It's local to a particular part of the West. Jeffrey talked about, the other part of the West that was subjugated. Genevieve in a book has written about the witch hunts and the Inquisition. 9 million people killed in Europe for thinking differently. 9 million, not a joke. So it was an epistemicide of the other mind of Europe, but it's still there, in elements. And I think false universalization and monocultures of every kind are a big part of our ecological and social disease.
So do you feel we will survive, or will we not survive this epoch?
That's not the question we have to answer. The question we have to answer is, am I doing the right thing? And knowing that there is uncertainty in the world, that's the second principle of quantum theory, to be able to live with uncertainty and not let it come in the way of the right action. Our duty is the right action. The outcome is in the hands of multiple forces. I mean, this is what the Bhagavad Gita also says, do the right thing, but do not predict an outcome. That's not in your hands anyway. And ethics and morality dharma is not controlling an outcome. Dharma is choosing the right path. What the guy called living in the moment, but living in the moment with all of the interconnections and complexities and all the relationships in mind.
What about you, Steve? What do you think?
I'll have to mix of the two previous views. I'm agree with Guy that I think industrial civilization is doomed. We won't turn it around. And our reaction to various breakdowns will probably make things worse. I mean, some of the nuclear possibilities that Jeff see, I think, are more likely to be caused by climate breakdown than even by the current political conflicts. But my overall fear is that industrial civilization will fail. And one of the ironies is the way you see the economists, how they've framed the dangers of climate change. They basically say, it's the poor people in the third world who are going to suffer, but us people in the rich developed West will do okay. In fact, there's even a video from, I think it's at Cambridge University, Kamiya Mahadi is promoting one of the recent Economist papers, predicting that a 3.2 degree increase in temperature between 2020 and 2100 will reduce global GDP by 6.77%. Nonsense, right? But he's saying previous economic studies said rich countries will actually benefit from climate change. Okay? And that's the orientation economists have. Well, I think the more realistic thing is the industrial world is so dependent upon an industrial agricultural system that when climate starts to destroy that system, it'll be the people in the West who are the first to starve on a mass scale, rather than the third world. And if you're in the third world, you are much closer to food production. And you're much more aware of what's necessary to have a sustainable system in your own community. So I expect adaptability is going to be inversely related to the degree of industrialization. And if I had to pick my one group of people that I think are most likely to survive this, I'd go for New Guinea Highlanders. Okay? They're so far remote from most industrial processes. They have to be self-sufficient. Industrial goods are flown in a helicopter right now. They can survive if the helicopters don't arrive. They're more likely to survive than virtually any other group. And then after that, the very end of the spectrum of survivability is going to be the white middle class in America. So the question is, how will we survive a collapse like that? What will be the white middle class reaction? I can't see it being healthy. Now, the only way to have any chance of, I'm not giving up on lives. I wouldn't want to guess how many billions of people are likely to die from climate breakdown in the next, if we're lucky, 50 years, if we're unlucky, 10 years. What I'm more worried about is maintaining human knowledge, because a huge thing that we've done, courtesy of the fossil fuel age, really, and propelled by it, is we've got an incredible level of knowledge about the nature of the universe. We know more about the universe from the quantum level to the galactic than any other time in history. And if we're the intelligent species, we should be both trying to maintain that knowledge and to use it for the preservation of life on the planet. Now, instead, we're using it for follies, and those follies are going to destroy us. So if I have any hope that we will be able to limit the damage sufficiently that we won't completely destroy every last living community on the planet, that we can somehow maintain the knowledge we've got, and that we can transcend the damage we're doing to the biosphere and see our role as maintaining life, not exploiting it. But whether we get there, I mean, I'm certainly, given the people in charge and given the political systems and the immense wealth that's come out of exploiting the energy resources we've found on the planet, I have to be pessimistic about our chances.
I think Guy had a reaction to Vandana's statements. Go ahead, Guy.
Yes, I should have been more clear. I'm using the standard definition of civilization, including the current civilization, of the ability and willingness to grow, store, and distribute grains at a large scale. So this is a grain-based ability to get through the so-called hard times by storing grains. And that's what makes this civilization similar to all previous civilizations.
Vandana, was that your understanding also?
You'll need to unmute.
You're muted. You're muted.
You need to unmute.
Yeah. A civilization is what connects us to the earth and to each other at a level higher than communities, where communities themselves become part of an organic whole. So ecology is a very big element of it, but so are social relationships and values. And what I was trying to say is tools of manufacture cannot be defined as those structures that hold societies together, the binding glue. Yeah, we talk about victory, things that break society up, and there's a difference between that which holds society. It provides the glue, and that glue is the compassion, the gift, the love, the care, not through an external policing, not through the Hobbesian imposition, but through the recognition of our being connected and the flows between us and the flows with nature that make us one.
There is another definition of civilization that I might want to suggest. Simply means the pacification of the conditions of human existence, which requires two things. One, the pacification of nature to allow us to subsist, and the pacification of violence in society, which is largely male violence. So essentially, it is being able to handle, tolerate, or find ways to adapt those two threats to human existence. Now, that is sort of a minimal definition for civilization of any kind to actually exist, reproduce, and so on. It's sort of a much more neutral definition, but it doesn't contradict what either Guy has said or Vandana has said. Let's invite Genevieve, who hasn't spoken for a while, into this discussion. Yeah. Genevieve?
Coming, yes. Thank you. Well, I think it is possible that we might survive, but I think we need to hurry. And I think we need to do a deep paradigm shift in order to be able to act in a way that we can further survival of our species and of the other species. And so it is a question of moving from one view of the world to another. And this crisis actually is showing us that we're doing the wrong thing. We're thinking the wrong way. We're making ourselves into the wrong kind of species. And we do have still, as Westerners, that epoch of life in the first 3 years in which we have this model of other orientation, this maternal, I don't want to say altruism maybe, or as they say also, altercentrism, that is attention to the needs of the other. And babies are brought up in the first 3 years in that mode. And so that's their model. And so as babies, we are all a species that could survive. But then our values and our mode of behaving gets contradicted by the mode of exchange and giving and only in order to get back, which is egocentric and not other-centric. So we continue to repeat the exchange mode rather than the gift mode. If we could shift everyone back into the gift mode, and I believe we're already doing it in many levels that we don't see, that are explained in other ways by patriarchal philosophy, which has always left out women and who were the mothers and who might have brought that message. If we can shift, then we can also begin to behave in life-sustaining and life-loving ways that could help us survive. Do we have time to do that? I don't know, but it's worth a try. And I think that the international women's movement of women who have not been assimilated into the capitalist ways can make those shifts and show that we can do that. So I mean, that's what I count on. That's what I work for.
Right. Let me throw this to Steve in particular, because he's an economist, and they use the term more often than others. But is capitalism the problem in this classic 19th, 20th century sense? Is that the problem, Steve? Is that why we're in trouble?
It's a large part of the problem, but the focus upon growth is the main problem. And this would have been the same. If you look at the Soviet system, what the Soviets did with the lakes of food production systems and so on. And if you look back the original documents of the formation of the Soviet Union, a large emphasis there was on growing to give everybody, a decent lifestyle in Russia. And this is Feldman's original document for the industrialization of Russia. So, and they ended up with environmental catastrophes that they also tried to conceal. So I don't think it's necessarily just capitalism. I think it's a society focused upon growth. Whereas if we focus
is it
upon
possible? Is it possible to have capitalism without growth, though? I mean, isn't it fundamental to capitalism to grow?
it is fundamental. I mean, this is why I attack neoclassical economic theory as being garbage from bottom to top, because their model gives you this idea of equilibrium, and if the firm reaches a point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, you don't grow past that point. Okay, that actually built into the underlying thinking of neoclassical economists is that a firm will stop producing at a certain point because any more output will cost it more than it makes it a profit, which is bullshit. When you look at actual firms, they have constant cost of production. They set a markup price above that. They make more profit with more volume. So there's obviously a growth imperative built into the individual firm, and then the whole society has that. And neoclassical economics makes that even worse. So yes, there's a growth imperative at the core of neoclassical. Now, if you had like a more inverted commas real socialism than we got with Soviet system, then you could have had an objective set, like a minimum standard of living objective set, rather than continually increasing the income level over time. And that system failed as well. For, economically, it failed in its own objectives, and you could see why it would fail if you take a look at Feldman's original arguments, because he assumed basically an infinitely growing labor supply, which of course was not possible. So capitalism certainly has it inherently. And therefore, if you have a capitalist system, you have to either find a way that waste don't accumulate in the biosphere, which is the Star Trek vision of the future, or a way that that you set up limits in the financial system so you can't get extreme disparities of wealth. But that's, capitalism inherently encourages that. So in its own right, it's a destructive system on a finite biosphere.
Is a term like capitalism useful in your analysis, Guy?
Yes, as long as we don't give it a capital C. It can be compared to other ways of managing society. And that's all we do, is we have these categories that we put our societies into. And so capitalism is one of those. I don't doubt that at all. So is socialism.
Mm-hmm.
But I think
yeah,
it's just a way of categorizing. I don't think it's anything larger than that.
I think also, like, one important point is that capitalism began when we discovered coal. Not discovered it, but realized we could use it to fire furnaces. So there's an inherent link between exploiting fossil fuels and the growth we've caused, and also the destruction of the capacity for that growth on the planet. So the fact that we, as Vandana said, we have all these energy slaves. The West in particular relies upon energy slaves. Without that, we'd still be having a 1700s level of the standard of living, but also a 1700s belief about the future that it was going to be much the same as the past, because you weren't expecting growth to go on continuously. If you look at the level of, standard of living of the average British person in 1000, pardon me, my throat, of the COVID.
That's okay, no problem.
In 1000 BC, AD, it was the same as the standard of living in 1900 AD. There was no real change. But the change started in 1750, and then we're blasted right past it. So that's the energy slaves. And they think that's very seductive. Everybody wants to have a slave, in the sense of it's nice to have somebody else to do the work. That used to be slavery. That used to be exploiting animals. Now it's exploiting fossil fuels. And that has been more benign for most people, because you're not whipping a human being, you're not whipping an animal. You're putting fuel into a petrol tank, and you suddenly can travel at ridiculous speeds from one point of the city to another. So it's very seductive to have energy slaves. But what we haven't realized, rather than whipping individuals or animals, we're whipping the entire biosphere. And it takes longer for the biosphere to get even. But it gets even a way that makes any slave rebellion look tame.
Maybe I'll transfer this question to Vandana as you recover. Is capitalism a useful concept in your system, Vandana?
I think capitalism is a system's name given to a regime of plunder. It was basically colonial commerce. That is what the system was. Colonial commerce of extraction with violence, genocide. And if you read Adam Smith, he's basically describing the colonial commerce phenomena. And then, instead of saying this wealth was made by ripping off the countries, 45 trillion was transferred from India to England. And the payment came from the peasants themselves, who then were pushed to starvation. 60 million died. 60 million died during the British rule. So I think putting an ISM behind it, of course, then took place with what all the Anglo thinkers of, the Bacons and the Hobbes and the Locks and the Darwin, then they created a system that seems to hang together in coherence. Earlier, it just hung together through violence and plunder. And, Locke talks about creating property through the spiritual labor of capital. Yeah. And all of them put capital as a magical creator, which all it was doing was extracting the value created by nature, the value created by women, the value created by workers. So, the only place where I use capitalism is to define capitalist patriarchy. Because the rest of, even today, for companies that make poisons to suddenly own the seed to give it the respect of capitalism, it's just a theft from nature and a theft from peasants. So I would rather just name it as plunder.
Right. So it's more routinized and regularized. Plunder.
Yes, yes, exactly.
How about Genevieve? Does the term capitalism make any sense within your system?
Yeah, I would like to talk about greed. I think that when mothers give unilaterally to children, they give value to the children. The children feel that they are valuable or they have self-esteem when that happens. And when the market and it allows capitalists to extract the gifts of the many, they also feel self-esteem because they have gotten these special gifts as their mother had given to them when they were young. And so this creates, in a world where even capitalists are alienated from each other, this creates a system of self-esteem that motivates them towards getting more and more and more, because it makes them feel more and more able to approve of themselves. And that, I think, is a big part of what greed is. I think we need to look at what is actually happening to them as their psychologically as individuals.
Right.
I
used to say that
but that has the function.
I used to say that a Buddhist could never pass a microeconomics exam because he or she may not agree to more is better. The higher indifference curve is not better than the lower one. What do you think of that, Steve? Are we compelled to pick the higher indifference curve because economics requires us to, or can we deviate from that? Can we deny that as a postulate?
Unmute.
Oh,
I'm sorry that Jeff isn't here to. I wish Jeff was here to continue that conversation because that's an essential point. The whole way neoclassical economics has been constructed has been to emphasize more and more consumption.
More is better. More is better.
Yeah, more is better. Yeah. I mean, if you gave me one banana, I'd be happy. 2 bananas, all right. 3 bananas, keep that bloody thing away from me. The whole, the timelessness nature, the idiocy of that fundamental presumption. But then that gets built into everything else they do, and economists are the greatest enemies of sustainability humanity's ever invented.
By the way, that's been called the pig principle.
Yeah, yeah. The funny thing is, this is why they're so dangerous. Most economists don't do all that well financially. Most of them work for the state. They're within government departments. They work in the government-funded universities, et cetera, and they're there trying to tear the state down and turn everything into free market, except themselves. It's quite ironic, really. They think they're dangerous zealots. That's why they do so much damage, and that's why, despite the fact that some of them are good friends of mine, I want to destroy that entire discipline, because it's what's really led us to naively get to the situation of civilization extermination, and they all think nothing's going to happen. They all reckon, as I said, that survey of 2,000 climate economists, 7 degrees of warming, a 0.1% fall in the annual rate of growth for the next 2 centuries. They have no bloody idea of the planet they're on, and they think they're making everything work better.
I used to say economics is a self-referential language game with zero representational efficacy. That was my definition.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'd leave it now to the panelists to bring up any topics. I've tried to keep this discussion going, but I don't want to force it. So any other ideas, comments are welcome. Anybody can make them.
I would just like to be in agreement with Guy about geoengineering being the next costly experiment of trying to engineer a planet and treating pollution, which is the problem, as a solution. And I think this mind of mastery, control, engineering, if we follow Jane's suggestions of the gift economy, then what we are talking about is a living planet with living beings and living organisms, and we as living, thinking, conscious beings, relating through knowledge and intelligence to others, relating through care. And at least from what I've learned in all these decades, both from quantum theory as well as now understanding living systems, is that giving is the way. But when every side gives, that's where symbiosis happens. That's where mutuality nourishes the processes. And you said it too, Rajani, when you talked about how people come together in family, in community, organically. But that's how living communities come together. That's how the soil organisms come together in the soil food web. That's how plants come together. That's how insects come together. And we've imposed so much of the predatory ideas of colonialism on understanding nature herself, red in tooth and claw, and constantly projecting things that were not happening. That then became biology, that became science. And I think it is a time to rediscover both ourselves, our place on Earth, and the Earth's amazing workings.
And capitalism itself was imposed. It didn't come spontaneously or naturally. It had to be, Anyway, so any other ideas that we have not touched upon that anybody would like to mention? Otherwise, we'll move into closure. Guy, yes, please.
Well, I'm afraid I'm just saying, what do I
Steve.
think is going to happen? Okay.
Right.
And whatever learning we might be able to do, it's going to be the current political and power structure that reacts in the context of the damage that climate change does to it. And in that, I can't see except that some countries, whether they're America or they're India, will go for rogue geoengineering to try to restrain the damage being done to their cultures. So I think we're going to face that world, whether we want to or not. And the question is, will we survive it? I certainly can't see us surviving the trend of which we're going towards. Jim Hanson's work predicting that 10 degrees is the ultimate settling point. I think, again, with Guy's arguments, I'd agree that that means the extinction of most life on Earth. 99% of species would go in that sort of warming. In that world, we're going to try to do something to slow it down and reverse it. And I think that's what's more likely going to happen. Whether it works, God knows, but I don't believe in God.
But let me then, as a final issue to think about, maybe even comment on. This is something I've thought about for the longest time. Is evolution, can it be self-immolating?
Yeah, well, it was. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a cyanobacteria. God knows whether it was about 800 million years ago, whatever it was, taking the atmosphere of the planet, which at that stage was heavily carbon dioxide and nitrogen, and converting it into oxygen and nitrogen and the small bit of carbon dioxide, wiping out all the anaerobic life forms that had existed beforehand. So we could be doing the opposite. We could be doing the opposite for aerobic life forms.
But we have the ability and perhaps even the willingness to get rid of everything, all life. We have the power to do it. And my question is, does evolution, do you think, it's a speculative question, that it will allow us to immolate the whole project? That was is it built in, do you think, in evolution? Or is it just, again, it's, yeah.
That's one of the arguments called the great filter. You know, people who talk in terms of why, where are the intelligent species in the rest of the galaxy or the universe? One of the arguments is there's a great filter which wipes out intelligent species, and that could well be what we're going through right now. That no other intelligent species that we're aware of has survived in the galaxy, and we could be following the same case. Another extreme is to say that life itself reaching the level of complexity of life on Earth is such a rare event. It might only happen once in a galaxy's history or once in the universe's history. We simply don't know. But the great filter argument, I can certainly see climate breakdown caused by us exploiting fossil fuels as a classic great filter, on the other side of which intelligence is a characteristic of life, self-aware intelligence with opposable thumbs and technology is eliminated.
So there is some teleology in this, obviously, but Guy, do you think evolution was programmed to self-destruct?
No, I think evolution arose, quote, naturally, and we are one end product of evolution. And like the 8 previous species in the genus Homo, we will almost undoubtedly go extinct. I would imagine that among those previous species that went extinct, there were many individuals at the end who said it could never happen to us. We're too intelligent for this. And I see that every day.
Yeah.
Vandana, what do you think?
For me, evolution is about change and adaptation. And of course, in the large picture, there have been periods of extinction, and there is deliberate extinction by design. But as I said before, there are processes leading to that, but we have duties to regenerate.
99% of all species that have ever existed are extinct. So why should we think we are an exception?
No, we don't have to think that way.
No.
I don't think we have to think of ourselves as a privileged species. Gaia has no privileged species. In Gaia's democracy, everyone's equal.
Right.
Not the same, they're diverse, but equal. And there's no privilege. So the issue is not privilege, and the issue of survival is not about privilege. For me, the issue of creating conditions for survival is our species being, as you said, and every species being. Not the guarantee of the outcome, but the process of engagement in generating the processes that would give our survival a chance.
So shall we leave Genevieve now with any final comments on this particular issue?
Yeah, I think that as pre-hominids, we evolved because babies were not totally developed when they came out of the womb, and they elicited the care of their caregivers. Otherwise, they would have died. All the species would have died. And this is the way that our species has continued, because the very vulnerable babies elicited care, and other vulnerable people have elicited care, and also parts of the environment. So if we can continue to elicit care and bring it up to even a more general level, perhaps we can evolve towards survival, not only of ourselves, but of the planet.
I think the key word you used there was if, and I seem to remember a song that said, no, I don't believe in if anymore. But anyway, thank you all. This has been terrific. I'm very grateful to each of you to have taken the time to do this, especially for Vandana, how late, it's very late for her.
11 p.m.
Sorry about this, but I'm sure we're doing this as a public service, as a public utility for others, and that's why I raised this question. But I thank you all very, very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye to everybody and the audience and the attendees. And we must thank Diane Weidenkopf. Would you please show yourself now, Diane, who has been behind the scenes? Yeah, thank you so much, Diane, for seeing us through. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Jen. Talk to you soon. Bye, Vandana. Bye-bye.